Hi. Okay, this is my third time doing this, so I'm going to go relatively quickly. What you see on the screen is the publisher's PowerPoint of the chapter that you're assigned for this week. Some of the content in the chapter I discussed in the text-based lecture, the little two-page intro that you read in a previous slide. The latter part of the chapter, the section on ethics, I have a separate video that I had recorded about a year ago that I'll use to discuss that part. So what I want to do now is I want to get through the gist of the chapter relatively quickly, and knowing that you can pause and rewind if you have need to rehear something. So I'll move relatively fast. So these are the ideas that we're going to cover in this chapter: the idea of interdependence, some definitions, exploring the concept of culture shock, ethics, and some fundamental challenges. So in terms of the connectivity, it's essentially impossible, or fundamentally impossible, for any culture to be in isolation and to exist on its own. We are technologically interdependent, economically interdependent, socially interdependent, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about already in this module. But here are some areas specifically in which interconnectivity might impact you. Exploring this idea of interconnectivity a little bit more, you certainly see the idea that it's the product of world trade, telecommunications, data, storage, as well as travel. And that is true on both a corporate level, and it also affects us in a family unit as well. Now we start to look at some of the idea of domestic diversity and international diversity. Domestically, there have been some interesting demographic shifts in U.S. history from a lot of different incidents, both within our borders and outside our borders. The statistic you see on the slide about 35% of the minorities, that may have been true in the book. This edition of the book was written about 4 years ago. I read a couple of articles earlier this year that describe that in many places within the U.S. And overall, the overall national statistic, minorities were quote unquote now the majority. So things are definitely shifting in our own country. U.S. immigration, the idea that immigrants move to particular places, how are they sort of clustering, what media does in terms of influence on the impression or the image of the media to the general population. The section on significant contributions, this right here, is terrific. I'm so glad that's in your chapter. It's a great thing to really explore and to take a look at. Technology has had a huge impact on culture for a variety of reasons. This section of the chapter discusses that, whether it's calling a helpline or a chat room and you find yourself talking to somebody in another country, whether it's a pen pal. There's so many different ways that technology has made the world smaller and allowed us to come together. Now, some definitions. Definitions may not seem very exciting to you, but they're important. So your book defines what intercultural communication is and also explores the concept of the dominant culture. Within the U.S., historically, the dominant culture has been a European male. So generally, the white man, oftentimes of a Presbyterian background with a socioeconomic system that is reminiscent of European banking. But anyways, your book will describe some of that. The term dominant culture is not used as much, although you will find it in some literature. When it says dominant, we tend to think of aggression and that kind of superiority. It is related to power, and so the word dominant definitely has some meaning. Whether that power is economic power or physical power, it's still the cultural group of influence. Co-culture, previously this term was a subculture. Uh, Now we commonly call it a co-culture. There are many co-cultures that you belong to. Certainly there are people in the class who might be into gaming. There's a definite gamer culture. Your students, there's a student culture. If you're a parent, you absolutely know that's a different culture, and you know exactly when you crossed over into that particular culture. So there are co-cultural groups that are related around sexuality, around hobbies, around different occupations, theology, religion. You can have co-cultures around many different groups. Society has to do with that organization, the way that we systemically organize human interactions. When you venture into a new culture, this is the section on culture shock. If any of you have traveled, if any of you have lived in another country for an extended period of time, no doubt you have experienced culture shock. If you have traveled for a good length of time, this is not, I spent a week in, Mazatlan. This is not even, I spent 2 weeks in Australia. Typically, it's a little bit longer than that. It's possible to hit culture shock with those short-term excursions, but generally it is symptomatic of people who stay in a new culture for a longer period of time. So it's that process of adapting to the new culture. With culture shock, there are 4 phases, and these are important. The first stage is the exhilaration stage, and you are so excited to be in this new place. You're ecstatic. It's just so cool. Everything's so different, and you're looking around at everything. You take a ton of pictures. You just want to go and you want to explore, and it's like a honeymoon phase. It's just very euphoric. And then you immediately drop. I mean, I say immediately simply because there's no other stage in between this. But the drop, when you hit disenchantment, the lowest stage, it's like boom. It's a sense of disorientation. You're very disoriented. Nobody does things the way that you're supposed to. And when you sit down in a restaurant, they don't do the way you're used to. When you want to order something or purchase something, it's not the way. When you greet somebody, when you say hello, when you say goodbye, it's not the way you're used to. Everything is different, and it begins to be very discouraging and overwhelming, and you realize you don't fit in, and you realize that you're different, and the lack of predictability leaves you very unsettled. This stage of culture shock is not cool. It's not fun. If you've been through it, it's not, you know what I'm talking about. And you don't necessarily mean to judge the culture that you're in, but you're absolutely not happy because you don't understand it, and it's frustrating. Sometimes it can lead to paranoia. Interestingly, a lot of times this low stage of culture shock leads to excessive control of the body and your immediate environment. In other words, you might have a spotless hotel room. You might spend so much time on your makeup and your clothes every day simply because it's one of the few things you can control, because the rest of your existence in this new culture is outside your control. So there's some interesting signs and symptoms that accompany this particular stage. The third stage is adjustment. And here, you've been at the high, you dropped, and now you're beginning to figure the new culture out. You've sort of figured out how people say hello and goodbye. You're not surprised when something happens a certain way because that's the norm in this particular place. You might learn a few words of the new language to get you through. You're not particularly happy, but you're figuring it out. Effective functioning, the last stage, and again, here you high, you drop, you build, and you go up. Effective functioning is we're able to adapt well to that new culture while still maintaining the identity of your old. In terms of how to function, here are some suggestions that your textbook gives you in terms of language. Ethnocentrism, which is huge. Make sure that you understand that word, by the way. Learn about the host culture and work to maintain your own culture. You don't want to so completely assimilate into the new culture where you forget your own past. Ethics, I'm going to fly through this because I talk about it later on in a different video. And generalizations, you can read the book for that. Objectivity, many people argue it's impossible. The iceberg, no, not that one. The Catch-22 exercise that you did illustrates the struggle, the difficulty with objectivity. And that's it for now.